You're watching World Insight on CGTN, still to come on the program. Lessons from the deadliest influenza pandemic of 20th century, in the words of a respected author. That interview right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The COVID-19 pandemic has quickly spread to all corners of the world. The WHO said the U.S. now is the new epicenter, with over 210,000 confirmed cases and over 5,000 deaths already. The pandemic bears resemblance to the 1918 influenza pandemic, the worst in history. The outbreak started in an army camp in Kansas, the U.S., and later spread unchecked, killing 25 to 40 million people worldwide, and the latest numbers suggest it is even bigger than that. John Barry, an American author and historian, wrote the book, The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history, that examines the collision of science and epidemics. Earlier, I had an interview with Mr. Barry. He said the final lessons of 1918 is very simple one, yet the hardest to execute. That is, those in authority must retain the public's trust. While this influenza pandemic is known as Spanish flu, he also explains why diseases should not be named after people or nations. For more, we are joined by John Barry, author of the book, Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. Mr. Barry, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me on.
I know things are going quite challenging in where you are, New Orleans, so thank you so much for sharing your time at this critical moment, Mr. Barry. Let me ask you by starting to say that we are in another pandemic, as declared by the WHO. But how would you compare the situation then, 1918, to now, Mr. Barry?
Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of similarities. You have a new respiratory virus jumping from animal to human, spreading rapidly. This virus is more contagious than 1918 was, but fortunately a lot less lethal. In 1918, in the developed world, the virus had about a 2% case mortality rate, but in much of the rest of the world, it was much more deadly. For example, in Russia, it's estimated as many as 7% of the entire population died. In Mexico, roughly 5% of the entire population died, and so forth. The virus had probably circulated for a while in China, because China in 1918, at least parts of China where there are good numbers, actually fared better than much of the rest of the world.
Why was that then?
Well, again, if the virus circulated there, the Chinese had experienced it, so their immune systems were better prepared to protect against it. Coronavirus, nobody's immune system in the world had ever seen it before, so it's highly contagious, much more than 1918 or seasonal flu.
Why so many people died in 1918 during that period of a great influenza?
Well, number one, it was a lethal virus. A lot of people died from secondary bacterial infections, probably a majority, but even today with antibiotics and intensive care unit care, it's roughly 8% case mortality for secondary bacterial pneumonias following influenza. And then the virus itself did many of the same things that coronavirus did, or for that matter, SARS or MERS. It could infect you directly deep in the lung, and when it got there, it caused many, many problems, exactly the same pathology that we're seeing today.
Mr. Barry, you were suggesting then, so in 1918, the federal government was lying to the different states inside the United States. Because there was a
without
war?
a doubt.
What really happened? Tell us more about that.
Well, the Woodrow Wilson was president. He was obsessed. His entire focus was on winning the war. Because of that, one of his tools was to create this infrastructure of propaganda. They didn't want to say anything that might be faintly considered negative and hurt morale and therefore hurt the war effort. We're not sure where the virus began. We do know it didn't begin in Spain, but it was known as Spanish influenza. So you had national public health leaders in Washington saying, this is ordinary influenza by another name. Some patients grew so dark blue from lack of oxygen that the doctor wrote a colleague saying he couldn't tell an African-American soldier from a white soldier. You could bleed not only from your nose and mouth, but from your eyes and ears. All of these are horrific symptoms. So when the public is being told that this is ordinary influenza by another name, the only message they're actually receiving is don't believe anything they're being told.
How much does it have to do with lack of preparedness? But on the other hand, how much preparation one could do or one country could do, really?
Well, of course, in 1918, they weren't capable of doing much. They had great scientists, but they didn't have the knowledge that we have today. Today there's a lot that can be done. Number one, surveillance to identify a new virus when it emerges. China did a great job in getting the genome out there to the scientific world as soon as it was sequenced, so we could get fast start on using supercomputers and artificial intelligence to match up drugs and simultaneously, work on vaccines. Mm-hmm. One of the main lessons from 1918 involves social distancing. China took extreme measures, obviously. South Korea, Singapore. I think one of the main lessons from 1918 was if you tell the truth to the public, you will get a lot better compliance and a lot more sustained compliance than you will if you lie. If you lie, you lose public trust and you don't get cooperation.
So at that time, mainly the states in the United States, for example, were relying on themselves. How would they be able to, gather all the resources to do what they desired to do if the federal government was not that much of help?
Well, in 1918, the federal government really didn't play a role. Wilson, the president, never made a single statement on the pandemic at any time. The federal government provided very little in the way of resources. But of course, society was very different then. We didn't have the supply chains and the international connectedness that we have today. A lot of things were much more locally sourced or regionally sourced. But it largely became every city for itself. The very first cities hit happened to be Boston. Nurses and doctors from all over New England did flood into Boston to help. This healthcare system there was overloaded. But very soon, every healthcare system was overloaded.
Mr. Berry, having heard what you just said about that part of history, made us to think twice of what's going on right now. First of all, let's trace back some of the debates about the overall strategy to take. Social distancing or not social distancing, or so-called herd immunity, as you may have heard that phrase earlier
Right.
In the debate. So let's go through some of these issues. Overall strategy. Herd immunity is about, okay, those who have better immune system, they will survive, and let's hope there will be vaccine, and let's hope that the virus will get weaker as time goes by. Now, scientifically speaking, one could understand that theory. But how is that theory viable anymore under the current circumstances when it comes to society's choices?
Obviously it would depend on the death toll. If the death toll were 0.001%, then that would make a lot of sense. If the death toll is 1%, well, then it's more contagious than influenza. If you're infecting 50 or 60% of the population, 1% is an awful lot of dead people. And I don't think anyone who really looked at those numbers, even the hardest-edged, pure economist, would think it was worth the price. I do think that this virus will come in waves. It will return. It's here, I think now, probably forever. But I also think probably the second time around, people's immune systems will recognize it and be able to deal with it a lot better. So I don't think it will always have the same kind of fatality rate that it has now. I don't think it'll be that dangerous. So that leaves the other equation, part of the equation that you mentioned, social distancing. As you're probably aware, the United States, frankly, has done a terrible job on getting testing out there. In Korea and Singapore, the testing is very important in the control of the virus. They were able to test, isolate, contact trace, and effectively maintain an edge over the virus without really widespread disease, and also maintain their economic activity.
You also see the difficult choices that the state of New York, the city of New York, state of California, in your country, just a few examples reflected by the rest of the world, had to choose. So what do you make of the overall strategy when our economy is developing? What should be the priority, though?
Well, I think given the fatality rate and the vulnerability of the population, it has to be health first. I hope that he is convinced by his advisors that he's wrong. If he continues down this path, it will turn out to be an advantage that we have a federal system. The actual public health decisions, the federal government does have power to do more stringent things than a state, but if a state wants to impose various restrictions, the federal government would have no power to order that state to lift those restrictions. So, it would be terrible messaging. It'd be difficult to get people to comply if Trump were to say, let's lift the sanctions, or not the sanctions, but the measures. But states could still leave those things in place and ignore what his recommendations were. Getting compliance would be difficult, but legally the states would have the authority to do whatever they wanted.
Another question, I want to trace back the history a little bit, because there were a lot of debates about where the virus come from, what should be the name of it, and it's becoming even a geopolitical debate. But now, of course, things have been settling down somewhat compared to earlier days. But this also brought up an interesting topic about why it's called the Spanish flu, because many believe, even by scientists and epidemiologists, that the virus at that point, at least apparently, started inside the United States and then spread to other parts of the world, and then coming back to the U.S. once again to be a bigger scale pandemic. So, Mr. Berry, as a historian and as an epidemiologist yourself, how are you looking at these debates?
Well, as far as the history goes, the explanation is pretty simple. The King of Spain got sick, made it a major story around the world, so warring countries wrote about it, it became known as Spanish flu.
Mr. Barry, WHO has been repeatedly saying that there should not be the name of a person, name of a place, and name of a country that should be used in the name of a virus. Do you, as a scientist, as a historian, support that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, frankly, Trump is strictly political reasons. You know, his whole shtick seems to be there's an enemy out there somewhere else. It's not us. He likes to blame someone else. He's never accepted responsibility for anything. I don't think that name is going to stick, even in the United States, even when used for political purposes, as it has been.
Mr. Barry, I really hope you would take good care of yourself and also your family.
Yeah.
Let's be united in a way to go through this very difficult process.
Thank you very much, and the same to you.
John Barry, the author of the book, The Great Influenza. A lot to be learned from history. Are we learning? I hope so. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook accounts. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.